character animation can look overwhelming, but this easy intro to character animation will show you that it can be easier than it looks. I'll walk you through how to recreate this intro animation, how to properly rig and animate a face, and other tips and techniques to get you started in character animation. In this lesson, we're going to import our character artwork. Once you're inside After Effects, you can right-click, Import, File, locate the character artwork file, make sure you import it as a composition. Footage dimensions, you can leave it as layer size. Click OK. We can go ahead and click here to enter our character ready to animate composition. In this lesson, we're going to parent our layers together. First thing we're going to do is duplicate our character animation composition. Press Ctrl D to duplicate. We're going to rename it. Press Enter to rename a layer. We can rename it Character Artwork. This is so we have an extra composition with our character artwork just in case we ever need it. So now let's select Eyebrows, press the Shift key, go all the way down to Nose, and we're going to connect all these layers to the head. We can use the Pick Whip, or you could use the drop-down menu, it does the same thing. Now select the ears and the hair back. We're also going to connect these to the head. We'll select our head, connect it to the neck. And our neck layer, we'll connect it to the body layer. And now for the second part of this lesson, we're going to need to change our anchor points. Let's go up here and we'll select our anchor point tool. Make sure snapping is enabled. This will make it much easier for us. So eyebrows, eyes, mouth, hair front, and nose all seem to be good. For our head, we're going to have to change our anchor point. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, select our anchor point. We'll slide her down to the bottom of the head. And remember, since snapping is enabled, it should snap right to the bottom of her head. The body anchor point looks to be in a good spot. For the neck, we're going to have to change its location. Again, select our anchor point tool. Drag it down. There we go. Ears are good. Now let's select our hair back. Get our anchor point tool again. We'll drag our anchor point to the top of her head. Now that all our anchor points are in the correct spot, our character should rotate properly. We want our character to spring onto the screen and then rotate back and forth before finally resting into the middle of the screen. This is what we call overshoot. Select the body layer, press P to bring up the position. Holding the Shift key, press R to also bring up the rotation. Right-click on the position, go to Separate Dimensions, because we're only going to be animating the X position. At the beginning of the timeline, let's change our rotation value to 90%. Press the stopwatch to put a keyframe. Then we can move over 15 frames on the timeline. We'll change our rotation value to a negative number. -8 looks good. Now let's move over to frame 23 on the timeline. We'll change our rotation value to a positive number. Let's try 3%. Now let's move to frame 28 on the timeline, and we can change our rotation value back to 0. Select our keyframes, press F9 to easy ease. Now let's head into the graph editor. For this animation, I'm going to be using the speed graph. For the first animation, I'm going to drag these handles all the way to the left. And for the second two animations, I'm going to drag the handles into the middle. We want our character to animate fast onto the screen, and then her animation will smooth out on the next few keyframes. There we go, now our animation is a lot smoother. Now let's animate the position. Let's drag our X position until our character is off the screen. I'm going to type in a value of 1400. Place a keyframe. Now let's move to frame 15 on the timeline. Now let's drag our character onto the screen. Let's try a value of 525 for the X position. Now let's move to frame 23 on the timeline. Move our character back to around 555. And then let's move to frame 28, and we'll have our character move to our resting position, which should be 540, which is exactly the middle of the screen. Just like our rotation animation, we're going to select our keyframes, press F9 to easy ease, head into the graph editor. And what we want to do is ease these keyframes very similar to the way that we eased our rotation animation. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we do want the animations to be very similar. Now let's preview what that looks like. They are much better. Now for the head animation. We can close our body layer. Let's select our head layer. Press R to bring up the rotation. Let's move to frame 32 on the timeline. Press the stopwatch to put a keyframe. Now let's move over to frame 36 on the timeline. Change our rotation value to 4. Now let's move to frame 42 on the timeline. Place a keyframe, because we want no animation to happen between these two keyframes. Now let's move to frame 46 on the timeline. We'll change the rotation value to -4. Now we'll head to all the way to frame 64 on the timeline. Press the Place Keyframe button. Again, because we don't want any animation to happen between these two moments in time. Then we can move over to frame 69 on the timeline. And we'll change our rotation value back to 0. So this is what we have so far. But it still doesn't look quite right. We're going to select our keyframes, press F9 to easy ease, and we'll head into the graph editor. For our first head movement, we're going to drag these handles all the way to the left. We're going to do the same thing for the second movement. And the same thing for the third movement. So right now your graph editor should look like this. There, now the animation looks a lot smoother. Now we're going to animate our character's eyes position. We can close our other layers. We'll select our eye layer, press P to bring up the position. Press the stopwatch to put a keyframe on frame 32. Now we'll move over to frame 36. We'll drag our X position to around 180. So now our character looks to the right. Now let's move over to frame 42. Press the keyframe button to put a keyframe because we don't want any animation between those two keyframes. Now we'll move to frame 46. We'll move our X position to around 140. So now our character looks over to the left. This is what we have so far. We'll move to frame 52, press the keyframe button. Move to frame 56. This time we'll move our Y position down to 235. Now our character is looking down. Move over to frame 64, press the keyframe button so that there's no animation between those 2 points. And now let's move to frame 69 and copy and paste our first keyframe so we go back to the original position. Here's what we have so far. To make the animation smoother, we're going to select our keyframes, press F9, head into the graph editor. For our first 3 animations, we're going to drag our keyframes to the left to have a fast animation. And for the last animation, we're going to keep it at the default ease so that the eyes have a smoother transition back into the final resting place. And there we go, this is what we have so far. Now we're going to animate our eyebrows, nose, and mouth. First, let's head to a point on the timeline where there's no animation. Frame 70. We'll create a new null object by going to Layer, New, Null Object. Let's rename it Face Controls. Remember to press Enter to rename a layer. Now we're going to connect our eyebrows, mouth, and nose to our new Face Controls layer. And we'll connect our Face Controls layer to our head. Now let's start animating. On the Face Controls layer, we'll press P to bring up the position. Let's bring up our eye keyframes, just for reference. Remember to press U on the keyboard to bring up the keyframes. On frame 32, we'll press the stopwatch to put a keyframe. We'll move to our next eye position. Now let's change the X position of our face controls. We'll drag over our X position. Let's try 185. We'll move to our next eye position. Press the keyframe button because we don't want any animation between those 2 keyframes. Move to our next eye position. Now let's drag our X position back. Around 160 looks good. Move to our next eye position. Press the keyframe button. Again, move to our next eye position. This time we're going to change our Y position. Let's try 300. Move to our next eyes position. Press the keyframe button. And finally, we'll move to our final resting position. And we'll copy and paste our first keyframe to go back to the original position. Now let's select our keyframes, press F9 to easy ease, head into the graph editor. Remember, I'm using the speed graph. For the first 3 handles, I'm going to drag them all the way to the left. And then I'm going to leave the 4th as the default. Let's preview what that looks like. We're going to have our ears move in the opposite direction of the rest of the character's face. So let's keep our eyes and positions open, just for reference. And we'll open up our ears position by pressing P on the keyboard. We'll move to our first eye position. Press the stopwatch on the ears to put a keyframe. Move to our next eye position. Now we're going to drag our X position in the opposite direction of our eyes. Somewhere around 158. Now let's move to our next eye position. Press the keyframe button. Again, move to our next eye position. And we'll drag our X position in the opposite direction. Around 172. Move to our next eye position. Press the keyframe button. Move to our next eye position again. This time we're going to drag our Y position on the ears to around 210. We'll move to our next eye keyframe. Press the keyframe button on our ears. And finally, we'll move to the last keyframe on our eyes, and we'll copy and paste the first keyframe on our ear layer. Select the keyframes, press F9 to easy ease. And again, we're going to ease these keyframes in a similar way to our earlier animations. We'll pull the first 3 animations to the left and leave the last one as the default. There we go. So the first thing we're going to animate is our character blinking as she comes onto the screen. With our eye layer selected, press the S key to bring up the scale. We're going to check the unlink button. Place a keyframe at the beginning of the timeline. Let's move over to frame 10 on the timeline. And we'll shrink our Y property to 15%. Now let's move over to frame 15. Change our value back to 100. Select our keyframes, press F9 to easy ease. Our second eye blink, we'll start it at frame 28, press the keyframe button. Move over to frame 32. Again, put our Y value to 15%. Move over to frame 36. Change our value back to 100. And our third eye blink will start at frame 64. Press the keyframe button. Move over to frame 68. Change our Y value to 15. Move to frame 72. And we'll change our value back to 100. In part 1 of the hair animation, we're going to animate our character's hair as she animates onto the screen. Let's select our hair front layer. Press R to bring up the rotation. Let's move to frame 7 on the timeline. Press the stopwatch to put a keyframe. Now let's move to frame 16. Let's change our rotation value to a negative number, maybe -7. I'll turn off the hair back so we can see what we're doing better. Now let's move to frame 23. Change our rotation value to a positive number, +5. We'll move to frame 26. Type in a negative number, maybe -2. And finally, we'll go to frame 29 and we'll change our value back to 0%. Now let's see what that looks like. Now you can see the hair swinging back and forth. Let's select our keyframes, press F9 to easy ease. I'm going to use the speed graph editor. For our first handles, we'll drag them all the way to the left. And for the remainder of the animations, I'm going to pull the handles into the middle. There we go. Now we're going to do the same thing for the hair back layer. We're essentially going to do the exact same animation. So let's head back to our first hair front keyframe. Let's click on our hair back layer, bring up the rotation by pressing the R. Press the keyframe button. Let's move to our second hair front keyframe. And we'll change our rotation to a negative number, maybe -5. I think that looks good enough. Now let's move to the next hair front keyframe. Change our hair back value to a positive number, +3. Again, let's move to our next hair front keyframe. Change our rotation to a negative number. And finally, let's go to our last hair front keyframe. And we'll change our hair back rotation value to 0. We'll easy ease our keyframes with F9, head into the graph editor. And we're going to do a very similar easing as we did with our hair front layer. And this is what we have so far. In the second part of our hair animation, we're going to animate our character's hair as she looks back and forth. Let's start with the hair front. Let's move to frame 32 on the timeline, press the keyframe button. Now let's move over to frame 36. We'll type in -2. Turn off the hair back layer so we can see better. We'll move over to frame 42. Press the keyframe button. Move over to frame 46. Type in a value of 2. Now let's move over to frame 64. Press the keyframe button. Now we'll move to frame 69 and change our rotation value back to 0. Let's head into our graph editor. Zoom in. And again, we'll drag our handles to the left. And we'll do that same thing for the next one. And again for the third animation. So now let's do the same thing for the hair back. For this one, we want our hair back to be going in the opposite direction. We'll turn our layer back on. Move to frame 32. Press the keyframe button. Move to frame 36. Change our rotation value to 4. Now let's move to frame 42. Press the keyframe button. Head to frame 46. Enter a value of -4. Move to frame 64. Press the keyframe button. And now we can move to frame 69 and put a value of 0. head into the graph editor. Again, we're going to drag these handles to the left for all three of them. So now that our main hair animation is finished, there's just one more thing I would like to do, and it's animate the position on the hair front. Let's select our hair front layer, hold Shift and press P to bring up the position. Let's go to frame 52, press the stopwatch to put a keyframe. Then we can move to frame 56, and let's type in a value of 41 into the Y position. Move to frame 64, press the keyframe button. And finally, we'll move to frame 69, and we'll copy and paste our first keyframe. So now the hair moves down as she looks down. Select our keyframes, press F9 to easy ease. And for this animation, I think I'll just leave it at the default easing.